All right, I'm Naman. I'm a product manager here at Stoplight, primarily looking at design and governance tooling. So helping build some of the design and governance tooling that we provide here at Stoplight. And today, what I wanted to talk to you all about is a couple of our new features, specifically masking and component libraries, and how they can help you encourage reuse and consistency across your company. So we'll just go ahead and get started. Like Beatty said, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A. I'll hopefully answer them at the end of this, and we'll also be doing a quick demo of all the features. All right, so what do I want to cover today? It's starting off just quickly giving an overview of what the problems are, especially at scale. So as you start building a lot of APIs, the number grows from say 1 to 2 to actually 10, 15, 100, thousands. And what kind of problems you can face and how some of our features like component libraries and masking can help with that. I'll give a demo, try and cover some of the features that we have there, how to use them, best practices there, and then talk a little bit about the roadmap that for some of these features and what we want to build after this, and also want some feedback if you have around what specifically would you want added in some of these features. And we'll take questions at the end. So just overall, the big view on these features is that we're looking to target consistency and reusability with these two particular features. There are other paths to API governance that we cover with other features like style guides, where we're trying to more enforce rules. There's collaboration, but component libraries and masking are primarily geared towards consistency and reusability. And as you grow, as your API program grows, it's hard building APIs that are consistent, that provide a developer experience where users using those APIs, be it internal or external, have a good experience. They're also duplicated effort in terms of building the same thing over and over again, be it models that you're using across your APIs. If you do not have proper governance in place, you could lead to building API slower, and two, not of the quality that you're looking for in your API, especially as your number of your APIs grow. So this is the from a bigger picture, the problem that we're looking to solve. But just digging a bit deeper, one problem that we see with some of our customers who've been building APIs internally is that you see duplicated models across different projects. So let's say you have the address model, which is commonly used across your APIs in different forms. What happens is if you duplicate it and start iterating on it across different APIs, one, it's hard to keep it consistent as to one designer or one team might build it a bit differently than the others, be it in the names of the properties itself or what it contains. And that's bad for developer experience. And plus, you're duplicating the effort itself on building these models. Same goes for, say, you have error responses that look different depending on what API is being built across your company, especially as your teams grow and there's lack of communication between them. And what we've seen really helps is reusing some of these models across your API. So instead of having to duplicate them, if you had the capability to build these common models, let's say this address model, and reuse it across different projects, what you would see is being more consistent. People can get started easily, even if new developers are coming in. They can easily reuse this model that you've already built, be it the governance team or be it some other teams that are building these. And that is where our feature called component libraries comes in. So before component libraries, Stoplight had one type of projects for designing APIs, which was an API project. And that's where you're building or designing your APIs itself. With component libraries, we've introduced a new type of project, and what it helps you do is build this domain of models JSON schemas only right now, domain of components that you can reuse across multiple APIs. And then we have mechanisms that I'll be showing off in terms of how you update them and how you iterate over them. You can create multiple libraries depending on how you want to structure reuse across your company, be it building company-wide library itself or teams building separate ones for their use cases, which can also be used by other people in the company if needed. So that's component libraries, and just digging into it a bit. We have a separate project type now where you can, for now, build JSON schemas within it. So if you have models that are used across your company, you could put them in this component library project. If you're already using some of these models and they're duplicated, you could move them from a component, API project to a component library, and then reference them from these APIs themselves. So there's this separate project type that has come in. And then when you actually go to an API project under components, what you'd see is these component libraries being listed as projects that you can consume models from. So if you have multiple, you'd see them in this list, and then you can go ahead and start using them. Now, this is the first step. You created a domain library and started consuming these models in an API project itself. But what about iterating? And that's where our update mechanism comes in. Say the governance team, or there's a central team looking after this domain library, or a set of people from which is cross-functional. What they could do is go ahead and easily update these models. Let's say you have a user model, and the feedback that you've been getting is that you want to add a new field to it. You can go ahead and do it, and it would not automatically go and break different projects that are already consuming this model. What they do is get a notification, which has a visual diff for them to see what has changed in the model. And if it's a breaking change or not, we also specify that. And whenever they're ready, right now, when they get the notification or later, they can choose to update the model. So what it allows you to is easily iterate on these component libraries, while the consumers are still sticking to how they design their APIs at the start. So let's say something that is already out there in prod, you wouldn't want to make that change unless you're putting out a new version of the API. But if something's still in design, it's a good time to just accept the update right then and there. So that responsibility goes to the actual designers and doesn't stop you from actually iterating over the API itself. All right, so that's component libraries. What should you include in component libraries themselves? And there are multiple types of cases where it would be a good idea to put them in this shared library rather than creating these separately in API projects. Let's say you have domain models that are specific to, if you're an e-commerce shop, there's a product model that should probably end up in a design library, or sorry, in a component library, so that every team who's building APIs and probably ends up using some of these can reuse them. Same goes for error models. Error responses being consistent is always a good idea. If you have a specific schema for pagination, there are metadata objects like there's a particular set of, say, a timestamp or other things that you return within your responses. That could be a metadata object that is again reused. Then the next step would be, if you're already using some sort of convention, like say you're using JSON API, you could create models for, there's a set of error responses, request models that are already defined in these specifications. You could create them so that there's more adoption for the standard that you're going for, let's say JSON API, especially if you're using it in combination with style guides. So a set of reusable models and a style guide to go with it, and there should be better adoption for some of these standards that you might be looking to follow. These are some of the kinds of component libraries that models that you can include in component libraries, but I'm sure there are other cases that our customers will come across. So if you have interesting ideas on what kind of models should go into a component library, let us know. And the next thing, which is even a newer feature, is masking, and that's what I want to go to next. So one problem was duplication of models across different projects, and that leading to inconsistency. But then there's this other problem that we see, which is it's a similar model, but it's being reused in different contexts a bit differently. A very good example would be an address model. You have a billing address and a shipping address, and it might have small, minor differences. But what ends up happening is, as to how OpenAPI is structured and JSON schemas are structured, you'd end up creating different versions of these models, or using some tricky syntaxes like combiners to actually maintain them. What we have, what would be better potentially is if you have this base model, address model, which then results in two variants of it, billing address and shipping address. And while you could maintain these variants, the parent model still maintains that relationship. So let's say if you add a field, you would see them in both, or if you have, or if you want to remove some of those fields from some of those variants, you could do that. And that would be, that leads to more consistency across your JSON schemas itself, but also iterating over them is easier. As you update your address model to include something, you wouldn't see inconsistencies in how it's being used depending on what context it's being used on, because the relationship still exists. And that is the problem that we try to solve or looking to solve with masking, which is basically allowing you as API designers to create different variants of these models or schemas and maintain them while still keeping the base version and iterating over it. And how that works is you can create masks within APIs and component libraries both. So let's say if you have a model within an API and there's a different variant for request and response, you could create a mask for it. Or if you have a user model that has billing address and shipping address, you could create two different variants of the address model and reuse it right there and then. So that's what masking allows you to do. And what you can mask is visibility. So removing a few fields. If you want to remove a few fields, you could do that. If a property is required or not, depending on the context of it, you can change that around, and you can change the description. So the description for a particular property might be different depending on what variant you're creating. So you can override that in a mask too. These are the things you can mask today, but as I'll talk about in the future for this for masking, there's other things that we want to allow for masking too. Like one use case might be country codes. You have a list of enum values, but in a particular context, you just want to have a specific set available. Instead of having to create a copy of it, you can mask it and remove some of those values in there. And then, like I said before, if considering you've created a billing address and a shipping address, but the address model still exists, the top level, if you add a field to it, it'll automatically update the different masks that you have created for it with the new field added, while still maintaining something that you have removed from them. So you can easily add fields or remove fields from your base models without having to do it in multiple places and keeping it in sync. And then when it comes to consumption, as you go and try and consume one of these models, and you might already know our components list, what you would see there is that beneath the model itself, now you'd see the masks for it. And it's as you click on it, now you're using the mask. It would show up in the preview as that. If you export your API specification, the mask would be represented, and it has a particular name to it. So while you're exporting the spec, it would use that name rather than the name of the base model itself. So this is masking. And when it comes to what kind of models you should mask, requests and responses being different, you could create different masks for them instead of having to duplicate them. If you have different variants of the same model, like I mentioned, a billing address or a shipping address, or slight variations in terms of what API it's being used on, like the user model might look a bit different in one API or the other. You could create masks for all of these scenarios and be able to use them within your API specification. All right, so this was a quick overview of what these two features do. What I want to get into next is just show you all how this works, how you can end up using it, and then we'll get back to a few of the future things that we want to talk about. All right, so here's my workspace, and the first thing that I get to is, let's say we're setting up our API program. We come in and we can create a component library, which is a set of shared models that we want to end up reusing as we design APIs across our process. For that, if you go to add a project, now with APIs and style guides, you see component library as an entry. And if I go into a component library, I can create a project from it. It can either be a Stoplight project, like one that is just connected to the web, or if you're using Git, it can be a Git project. Git could always be the preferred version in terms of if you want to do reviews on it, do merges, especially component library being used in so many different places. We always look at the main branch. So we'd be looking at the main branch for things you're consuming, but you could still go through the whole Git flow itself. I already have a component library created, so I'll go ahead and start editing that one just so that we have a bit of data in there. All right, so it looks very similar to an API project, but there are a few differences. You cannot create APIs or articles or endpoints here at this point. It's just JSON schema models at this point. But we will be adding support for parameters, headers, other things that you might end up reusing across your API program. Right now, to start off, it's just models, but as you can see, I already have a few models created here. And if I want to, let's say a user model is a common one that I want to reuse across my API program, I can create that. Use the same JSON schema editor that you're used to in API design projects. But as you publish this, and if I go to an API project now, which I have right here, I should be able to see these component library models within my API while I'm designing my API. So let's say if I want to create a new path, which is /users, I can just when I add a body, I can just go into this. And if I go into components, you'd see the models I already have here in my project, but you'd also see the ones that are coming from the component library. Like I said, this could be multiple component libraries. We have filters here. So if you're looking to just look at component libraries, not look at the project itself, you could do that too, or the other way around. But I have a user model already here. So instead of actually creating a new model within the project, which might become inconsistent, I can just click on user here. And what I'd see now is within preview that I'm getting all the fields that I've created within the component library, and I can start using them. I can do the same within responses. So anywhere where you can use schemas, you can use component library models. And if I go ahead and publish it, I'd see those changes in my documentation itself too. But just to show the next step, which is iterating over it, if I go ahead and now go into the component library again, and I was using the user model, I can update it, and you'd see that you'd get a notification within the project. So I'll just go ahead and say I want to add a new field to this, which is I already have the roles, so I'll just add a test field. It's hard to come up with names. All right, so I'll add a test field in here, and what I'd see is as I go back to my API project, I'd get a notification as this has been changed. So the person who's managing this component library can go ahead and start making changes, but I wouldn't get those changes right away within my API project because this might be something that's already in prod and I don't want to break things. As I go into the API project, and go to components. I should see a notification that there has been a change within the model that I'm using. So you just get notification for things that have changed with it, that you're using itself, not everything. All right, so these are the three models I'm using from the component library. And if there's anything changed within them, I'd get a notification. And the notification shows up right here. If I click on this, as I can see, I've changed two models. For product, that's not something that I'm looking to review or take an update on right now. So I can individually review each changes. So let's say I want to review user itself. What I see is that the test field has been added. And this is also being used by the product model that I'm using. I can either choose to ignore this or I can accept the change. But if I accept the change, as this might be an API that's still being designed, so I want to be on the latest. And I go in here, I'll see that the test field is now shows up. If I want to ignore it, I can ignore it and it still have the notification like you see for the product model. And whenever you're ready, you can go in and actually review it and see if you want to make that change, be it a new version or be it a new API that you're creating within this project itself. These updates apply across the project, so you cannot update a particular instance of it. And that's primarily to maintain consistency across a project, at least as to not have different versions of the same model. So probably might be a bit of a blocker if you have a lot of APIs that are using different versions, but just to maintain consistency across the project, you have the same version. But if it's multiple projects, you can be on a different version on another project and a different version on another project. All right, so that's component libraries. The next thing that I want to show, and that's for that, we can go back to the component library project itself, is masking. So if I go into the component library again, what I'd see now is that I do have the user model in here. And let's say I did not have the masking feature. This is how I'd build things. I had the address model, which had 4 fields. And then I created a billing address, which did not have country, while also created shipping address, which did not have the state. Not the greatest example, but there are these subtle differences between billing and shipping address or a user employee role and admin role. What you can do is, instead of the user model be using 2 different versions, and if I want to update it, have to update it in multiple places, I can just create a new mask. So as I hover over one of these models, I'd see this option of creating a mask. And I can go ahead and put billing address as a mask that I want to create. And now that the mask shows up, like you can see, the fields that we have within the address model also show up in billing address. You do not have the ability to add new fields. The idea is that the parent model is all-encompassing in terms of what fields should contain, and this is a subset. And why we went down that road is to ensure that you cannot change the structure of the model completely, and yet create variants of it. So you can remove things, but not like completely remove all fields and add new ones just to create a new model, just because your use case looks very different. So I have the billing address here, and what I wanted was not to have the country field, so I can remove that. I can also, let's say in this case, I do not want the state to be required. I could click this, and now state shouldn't be required. So as you can see in the preview here too, that the required field is taken away. I could put in description. That's one of the other things that you can mask. So this is a billing city. So it would just for this variant show up, while in address, you still have everything that you need. And you can go ahead and create one for shipping address too. And, now for shipping address, I do not want the state, so I could remove that, and maybe the country is not required. As I go ahead and do that, now I could remove these models, these duplicate models that I have, and just maintain the address model and then masks on top of it for billing and shipping address. Going to the user model, I can now, instead of these references, which I actually removed, I could start using the mask that I have. So the masks would show up in the preview here. And as I use these models within my API projects, that would also be represented. As you can see, the types are the type names for the masks. So you could have different type names. The fields are also coming from the parent one, but masked on top of it. And I can now go ahead and publish this. Now, when I go back to my API project, you can go to edit, and now I should get a notification that the model has been updated that I was using. And this time around, it's actually using a mask rather than it using the different models that we had. So if I go in here, I should see that the user model has been updated. And this seems, it'll show you a diff of the problems here. There's some sort of a problem here, but it'll show you a diff, and then you can accept those changes, and you will see that now it's using the masks. We should see the description here too, what we masked in terms of what's not required and what's required. All of that shows up. Now you can mask one within component library projects, but you can also mask, and this is for if you do not have the case where you have a large number of APIs and you're using masking within component libraries, you could still have a case where just within your project, you have these models that you need to be used in different variants. And you can do that for local models too. So an example is, let's say I have orders here, and the request and response look a bit different. Let's say the ID is not something that we want to end up putting in the response, but the request, but it ends up in the response. That's something that I can do. So I have the order model here. This is a local model, not something that is coming from a component library. I can do the same thing, which is create masks for it. So if I go into the component section, I should see the masking option here. Much like in the component library, I can create masks, but for the request, I do not want the user ID to be there, but the response, I do want it to be here, and most of it is required, let's say. So it's not just within component libraries that you can mask things. You can also mask things within API projects. And now if I go into the endpoint itself within the project, I should see that there's a request and response mask that I can use. This is while this is available for component library models and available for API project models, it's not available for models within an open API. And while people do end up using models within an open API spec too, what we recommend is that the best practice is to create models on a project level so that you can reuse them across a project at least, and then have to and where you can create masks and then actually reference them. Now, just to get into a bit more detail as to how these features work, you might be used to looking at the code view, and while if you have direct references within a project, the reference is something along the lines of which would look like this if it's within a file, or if it's to another file, it would be a file name. But for these component libraries and masked models, the reference looks a bit different, something that not other tools would be able to recognize, which is a stoplight reference. And the reason for that is for it to be, one, we need to maintain versions. So if a new update comes in, we need to make sure that that update is notified. And if you rename models or change the structure of it, we'll still maintain that connection based on this reference that you have. So the question comes as to how would you use this and other tools? And the idea is, while this is your design space and you're reusing things, creating a component library, reusing those models, if you want to put this open API to use to say, generate SDKs, put it on a gateway, you can click on export here. And if you're exporting the API from Studio, and if I copy to clipboard here, put it here, you'd see that all the models that we're using are all dereferenced. So you wouldn't see anything of those stoplight references within the exported specification. So you'll see the masked objects. They would have the fields removed that you wanted them to remove. If you put in descriptions, all of that would be in here. And if you pass this specification onto a tool like a gateway or an SDK generator or code generator, it would actually recognize this and start generating this, start generating code from it or whatever else you want to do with this open API specification. And while one way to export this is using the UI, we also recently launched an API, which there's a webinar, I think, later this month that you'll go know more about. But this is also available on the Pro and Enterprise plan. But within API, you can actually automate this. So as you design these APIs, create pull requests, you can call this API and get the exported specification to for your downstream tooling, be it in your CI or in other places that you want to automatically get these exported specifications for. And if you're using component libraries, masking some of these features, I'd highly recommend looking at Catalog API or the Export API that we have as a feature that goes hand in hand with this to actually automate once you're reusing these models from other projects using masks, be it within your API project or from component libraries, because that will help you automate this. But you can always also export from the UI if that's available. All right, so that's pretty much for the demo, and we'll get back to some of the other slides that I had. Just to get the point across, if you want to use these features with downstream tooling, use the exported API specification. The exported API specification has bundled specs, so it follows best practices in terms of how we bundle those models, we reuse wherever we can reuse, what good names are in there. So hopefully the code generated would be of high quality, or if you're putting it on a gateway, that should work pretty well too. And this is, like I said, this is also available as an API now, so you can automate this. Maybe Bailey can share the link to the registration for the webinar, but there's another webinar that will go into the depth and deep into how you can use the Catalog API itself. So we talked about two features, masking and component libraries. They're very similar in terms of the goals they're looking to achieve, which is we want people to building consistent APIs, reuse whatever they can across the organization, while still having the flexibility to use it in different ways, and making it easy for people to maintain these models over time, be it the governance team that's maintaining the component library, or within your API project if you have different variants of the same model. It's component libraries and masking is one piece of toolkit on Stoplight, which is to promote reuse, but we have other parts too, like style guides, which is used to enforce rules. We have discussions now within Studio, which can help you comment on different things. And the combination of these features, we think, help you govern your APIs better. But if there are other features that you'll be looking for in governance, do let us know. Vote in our roadmap so that we can actually look into building some of those into the tool itself too. Talking about what's down the road for masking in component libraries, like I showed you today, you can mask things within component libraries and within APIs, but sharing these masks as separate entities is something that we want to do so that you can create masks within component libraries and share them share them with other projects too, not just within models. You can mask other fields like enums and other validation properties, like let's say the minimum, maximum value. We're looking into feedback as to what other things you would want to mask. We also want to add the ability to share headers, parameters, request responses within component libraries. So today it's just about models, but we want to increase that surface area to actually cover other things that are a good use case for reuse itself. And this feature is available on Pro and Enterprise for everybody right now. So be it masking, be it component libraries, be it catalog API, all of that is available. On this feature, primarily on the feature plans, primarily geared towards the governance, towards people who are looking to govern their APIs. All right, that was pretty much it from my side. So now, if you have questions, let me know.
We do have one question. When do you anticipate other components, headers, parameters, examples, request bodies, etc., to be available in component libraries?
All right, so we do not have exact timelines on it, but we are going to be working on improvements to the component libraries as in the later part of this year, so end of this year. So that might involve adding some new things like parameters, headers, but also improvements to masking, like shared masks that I talked about. There are no strict timelines right now, but we're hoping to work on it by the end of the year.
And then how is this feature related, separate to, from polymorphism and inheritance? There are 4 open API keywords, all of, one of, any of, and not.
So while open API features like all of, one of, any of do exist, they're primarily geared towards validation. While people do end up using it for combining models or removing some fields, I think the idea with masking is to make it much easier, introduce versioning and other pieces to it, provide naming capabilities, all that, which makes it easier, rather than those keywords which are hard to interpret and it's harder for tooling to support. All right.
When will it come out with beta?
It's so we're aiming for it to be out of beta by the end of the year. We have a previous version of this called design libraries that some of our other users are using too. So we want to migrate everybody over to component libraries, and that's when it will be out of beta. But for all intents and purposes, for new users, it's good to use. We're looking for feedback for sure, but it should be stable enough for you to now start using it within your prod design environments.
Is scope global, visibility based on teams for EG?
So yes, currently for component libraries, there's internal visibility which allows you for everybody to see it, but you can control who gets to edit it, which is if you have a set of team that only works on editing these component libraries, you can add those folks only. So those are the only people who can actually edit it, while everybody else can consume it. So there is that viewer versus editor concept, but if it's set as an internal project, it will be available for everybody. There are no group or team level component libraries as of now, at least.
Let's see, versioning of component libraries available, question mark?
So right now, it's like I showed, it's like a minor versioning for models, which is if you make an iteration, people will get a notification. We also have, which is if you have address model as V1 and V2, which is major versions, which you want to maintain separately, you can put it in the file name as address.v1 and address.v2. So what we look at is versioning for models are done individually rather than the whole library itself. But there are certainly cases where we could potentially in the future add multiple branches that you can have published. So you could have a V1 and a V2 branch, but right now it would be on the model level that you can do versioning.
What about comments and metadata objects available to allow links in docs? ?
I'm not sure about that question, so if you could clarify a bit, but is it primarily geared towards comments within JSON schema objects?
I would assume so.
All right, so we do not support that, at least right now, but there's certainly something that we get a few requests on, but if that gains traction, we'll add support for it.
All right, we also have, will you enable being able to add properties to a masked model locally in an API?
That's not intended right now. Like I said, I think the parent property being the one where which contains all properties, and then you can remove properties. But if we do get feedback, there's certainly the possibility of adding that to a mask. But right now, the recommendation would be, if you're looking to do something like that, use one of those open API keywords to combine that with a mask, because that should work. So.
And then we have, I'd love to share this presentation with other developers in our organization. Oh yeah, we will be publishing it on YouTube, and we will share the link after this.
So component library projects, yes, can be connected to Git. So you can create a component library project which is connected to, say, GitLab or GitHub. We support multiple of these VCS providers like GitLab, GitHub, Bitbucket, Azure DevOps. So, and it would be stored as JSON schema files there. Masks, though, are not stored within the repository itself. It's more a link that points to a Stoplight database. But you can have a component library project connected to Git. You can go through the whole Git workflow, create branches, create pull requests, and the main branches which would show up for developers as changes that are actually available for them to consume.
Awesome. And then final call, any other questions? If not, you can feel free to pop over to our community Discord page if you have more, and we will be sending a recording around after this. Okie dokie. Thank you so much, Naman.
Thank you so much, everybody. Hopefully this is helpful.